White blood cells are also called leukocytes, and they're probably some of the most important cells in our body. When we think of the immune system, your immune system is basically there because of the function of white blood cells. So white blood cells are in our blood, and they're always circulating and trying to look for signs of infection, trying to control infection. They play a major role in inflammation. They play a role in trying to eat up cancer cells. So if you've ever wondered why white blood cells are called white blood cells, it's because under a microscope they look colorless, not like red blood cells. Red blood cells are very red because they have something called hemoglobin in it, which gives blood its red color. So when you take blood and you spin it in lab, white blood cells form this thin whitish layer. That's where they get their name from. But the important part about white blood cells is that there's so many. It's like a team of different cells, and each type has a special unique function, each white blood cell. So I want to try to break it down, and it can seem a little bit overwhelming at first, but once you get to the end and you see how everything is put together, it starts making sense. So starting off with, where do white blood cells come from? All white blood cells are made in something called our bone marrow. That's the inside of our bone. So if you take a bone and you break it in half, it's the soft, spongy tissue inside your bones. And from there, they develop into different types depending on the needs of our body. So some white blood cells stay to have this general purpose and they're fast acting. Others are very specific and they can remember past infections for years. Some of our white blood cells are in the blood, others are in tissues, and together all of them come together and they form our immune system. So we organize white blood cells into three major functional groups. There's granulocytes, phagocytes, and lymphocytes. Granulocytes are cells that have granules inside them. They're filled with enzymes and different chemical signals. Phagocytes are cells that do something called phagocytosis, meaning that they eat microbes that make you sick. And then there's lymphocytes, which are important in providing long-term immunity, which is what we call adaptive immunity. So I want to go through each type and what they do and where things like neutrophils fall and all these other white blood cell types. So starting off with granulocytes, granulocytes are these white blood cells that contain granules, meaning when you look at them under the microscope, they kind of look like polka dots. So they have these granules, which are these tiny sacs that are filled with toxic enzymes. There's histamine, there's immune signaling molecules, there's various things. And so under the microscope, they look grainy, which is why they got their name. And they act fast and they don't require prior training. So these cells are your immune system's first response. They're part of something called our innate immunity. Starting off with neutrophils. Neutrophils are a specific type of white blood cell. They're the most common white blood cell. They make up about 50 to 70% of all white blood cells, and they're the first cells to go during an infection or inflammation. They use phagocytosis to eat up microbes, and they also release enzymes to destroy them. They're very short-lived, so after fighting an infection, they die and they become part of pus. Neutrophils go up, their numbers go up during an infection. So if you ever take a blood test and you see neutrophils go up, it means that the person probably has an infection. They go up in injuries and burns and inflammation. When people have physical or emotional stress, their number also goes up. Then there's eosinophils. These make up about 2% of white blood cells, and they're important in fighting parasitic infections like worm infections. So if you travel and you drink contaminated water, then you might get a worm infection. And so then the number of eosinophils go up. They're also active in allergic conditions, things like asthma and hives and eczema. So eosinophils go up in parasitic infections, in allergies and other things. And then there's basophils. Basophils are the least common white blood cell. They make up less than 1%, and these cells are filled with histamine. So when they burst, they release histamine and other inflammatory chemicals. So when we think of histamine, we think of allergies. So when people have allergies, a lot of times the basophil number is high. These are important in chronic allergies, and they help other immune cells respond to parasitic infections as well. So eosinophils go up during allergic reactions and parasitic reactions. There's another type of white blood cell that's called mast cells, and they're similar to basophils, but they're in our tissues, especially in your skin and your lungs and your intestines. And these release histamine and other mediators of inflammation. By the way, we called histamine a pro-inflammatory mediator. So when there's histamine, you see a lot of inflammation. And so mast cells are important in anaphylaxis, in asthma, and food allergies. They're immediate allergic responses, and they're important in chronic inflammation. You see them. Next, when we talk about phagocytes, so what are the cells that do phagocytosis? So when we say a cell does phagocytosis, it means that it can eat up something. It's usually eating up pathogens, which are microbes that make you sick. They can eat up dead cells. They can eat up just recycled material in your body. So that's phagocytes. And when we think about that, there's monocytes. So there's macrophages. So monocytes circulate in our blood and they enter our tissues to become macrophages. And they're found in almost all tissues as these long-term resident immune cells. And they're very important in phagocytosis. They're important in something called antigen presentation, meaning that when they eat up a pathogen, they break it up into parts that we call antigens, and they show it to other immune cells like T cells to turn on your whole immune system. There's cytokine production, which they produce a lot of these chemical signals, and then they're also important in tissue repair. So macrophages essentially are important in cleaning up infections, in inflammation, and in turning on adaptive immunity. Next, there's dendritic cells. Dendritic cells are found in our skin and mucosal surfaces, so surfaces where you see a lot of mucus. And what they do is they capture invaders and then they travel to lymph nodes in our body and they present pieces of the pathogen, which are called antigens, to a type of white blood cell called T cells, and they act as these immune system trainers. They also produce chemical signals that we call cytokines to just calm down the response. Dendritic cells are important for kind of bridging this gap between innate and adaptive immunity, and they also are important for starting targeted immune responses. Next, there's lymphocytes. Lymphocytes are the specialist cells of adaptive immunity. So lymphocytes are the most precise and best defenders. They can recognize specific pathogens and they can remember them for years after they've been trained. So there's B cells, which are also called B lymphocytes, and they mature in our bone marrow, and B cells produce antibodies. Antibodies are important because they bind to and they neutralize pathogens. Some become memory B cells for long-term immunity. So B cells are important for vaccine response, for defending against viruses and bacteria and fluids. And then next, another type of lymphocyte is called a T cell. So T cells and T lymphocytes are essentially the same thing. T cells form in the bone marrow, but they mature in our thymus. And there's two main types of T cells. There's helper T cells and cytotoxic T cells. Helper T cells coordinate and activate other immune cells. They basically help turn on your immune system. Cytotoxic T cells are toxic, meaning that they directly kill infected or cancerous cell. And they also form memory T cells after infection or after vaccination. So T cells are important for fighting viruses, for killing cancer cells, and for regulating immune responses. And then there's also natural killer cells. These are part of our innate immune system, the immune system that we're born with, that's always with us. And Natural killer cells don't need training. They can detect and they can destroy virus infected or abnormal cells immediately. They're especially important in early infection and also for cancer, for detecting early cancer cells. So natural killer cells are involved in early defense against viral infections and targeting tumor cells or cancer cells. So finally, putting all of this together, even though these are all called white blood cells and all white blood cells are called leukocytes, there's different classes of white blood cells. And this is the reason why a lot of times doctors will take a blood sample from you when they don't know what's going on, because it's important to look at the numbers, because if you see numbers going up or down, it can indicate a few things. So for example, neutrophil numbers get very high during an infection. So if you have two people and one of them, the neutrophil number is high, there's a high chance that their body is dealing with something. And that's because their body is trying to control the infection. So it starts producing a lot of neutrophils. There's eosinophils and basophils, which fight parasitic infections and they trigger allergies. So when you see their numbers go up, they can mean those things. There's macrophages and dendritic cells, which clean up things and they activate immune memory. And then there's lymphocytes, which are very important in our adaptive immune system. So different types of white blood cells increase depending on what the body is fighting or what it's going through. So that's why your white blood cell count can help diagnose infections or at least give an idea of what's going on. So those are white blood cells.